It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
For families worried about cost of living pressures, it will be a real relief that inflation has fallen finally to much more normal levels.
Well, inflation has fallen, but of course it remains above the Bank of England's target. And this is just not the time for a victory lap and popping champagne corks.
The rate at which prices are rising falls to 2.3%. Police are told to make fewer arrests to ease prison overcrowding.
I'm clear that the levels of legal migration into our country are too high. They place unsustainable pressure on our public services, on local communities, and that's why I've taken decisive action to bring the numbers down.
But can that be achieved without reducing the number of overseas students at UK universities?
How can it be that there are no safe routes for Palestinians to reach sanctuary in the UK, even if they have family here?
Should we have a scheme for Gazan refugees to come to the UK? And Rishi Sunak faces Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll bring you that live at noon. Joining us today, Labour MP Rachel Maskell, Conservative MP Matt Warman, the co-editor of Tribune, Taj Ali, and academic and senior advisor at the free market think tank, the Legatum Institute, Matt Goodwin. This is Politics Live. Let's start with inflation, because the rate of inflation has fallen to its lowest level in 3 years. It's down at 2.3%. It is down from a record high of 11%. Prices are still rising in most cases, but more slowly. My opening question to the panel is, will Rishi Sunak get credit for the fact that the rate of inflation has fallen to close to its target of 2%?
Well, we must remember it's the Bank of England which makes the decision independent from government, a measure that Labour took in the last government. And of course, the people on the grounds are still paying those high mortgages, the prices are still high, so people won't be celebrating today. Obviously, we're tracking the impact of inflation falling, but the impact it's having on families at this time when they're having to expend so much of their household income on funding just everyday living, of course, people aren't feeling it at the moment. So we will watch to see what happens. But the instability, which has now been baked into our economy, is, of course, a cause of concern, not least with the government's commitment to cutting £46 billion out with removing the national insurance contribution. So more instability on its way, I fear.
The Prime Minister made it one of his pledges to cut the rate of inflation. It is close to the Bank of England's target of 2%. But will Rishi Sunak get any credit for it?
So I think this is really meaningful progress, but to be fair to Rachel, one of the points that she made is it will take a while for people to feel this in their pockets, just as the national insurance cuts take a while for people to really notice that their taxes are being cut. So I think we do need time for this sort of thing to filter through into the economy. But it is huge progress. It is a real sign of the Prime Minister making a plan and making it work.
Will people be feeling better as a result? Will they welcome this news? And will Rishi Sunak get the credit for it?
I don't think he'll get the credit for it. I think people are already feeling the pinch. You know, we're seeing food prices up by 30% in 3 years. Just because the rate at which prices are increasing is decreasing doesn't mean people aren't worse off. And when you look at pay rises that many workers in the public sector have had, it's often been lower than the rate of inflation. So millions of people in this country are worse off. You do your weekly shop in your Tesco and you'll see the increase in prices. You put petrol in your car and you see it. You see the difference from a couple of years ago. You look at the housing crisis at the moment and people are really struggling to pay their rent. So I don't think people are feeling worse off. And I think this is going to be a crucial question at the next election. Cost of living is the #1 concern for millions of people across this country.
Well, and the question will be, will you feel better off, or do you feel better
Exactly.
off? Matt, to you. Will Rishi Sunak be praised for this?
Unlikely. That question, will you be better off? That was the Ronald Reagan question. Some of us will remember. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And I suspect Keir Starmer will spend much of the election campaign, whenever that is, asking that question over and over and over again. There's very little evidence in the polling the Conservatives are benefiting as inflation continues to fall. And I think that's probably because it's local council tax bills going up, it's mortgages being more expensive, it's shopping, it's everyday stuff that people are feeling. So I don't think Sunak will benefit.
Right, Matt Goodwin mentions again the date of the election, whenever that may be. There has been speculation again and talk that Rishi Sunak could call an election as soon as today for a summer election, because he had said his working assumption was that there'd be an election and he'd call one in the second half of the year. Well, technically that could be July. Are we expecting one?
No, is the short answer. And since I was coming on here, then I've asked a couple of quite senior people at the centre, and they poured a bucket of cold water on this suggestion. I don't think there is any sensible appetite for this, and that's because you're going to see those economic benefits continue to filter through. You're going to see, hopefully, Rwandan flights get off the ground. There are plenty of good things that the government, I think, is working on. There are real signs that they're going to be happening. Those are the things that I think we'll be focusing on over the next 6 months or so.
Right, so when are you expecting it then?
Well, I think most people are still expecting that sort of October, November, December kind of period. I think George Osborne reckons it will be November the 14th. He's quite plugged in.
He's quite plugged in. He's not part of the government, of course, as I remember. Could we be looking at a different team that takes the government into the election?
Well, I don't know, is the short answer. I think what we do need to see is that plan that Rishi Sunak has talked about delivered. That is not solely about personnel, that is about outcomes. And so I think we do need to see that agenda for tax cuts persist. We need to see that plan around immigration persist, those key targets. As you say, there are plenty of rumours in Westminster. I don't know anything about that sort of thing any more than you do.
Right, but you have spoken to people at the heart of government, or perhaps at number 10, so you would be surprised, eat your hat maybe, if there was an election called?
I would be surprised if there was an election called today, yes.
Let's have a look at this headline. In the Times, arrest fewer people to save prison space, police chiefs told. An internal document by the National Police Chiefs Council recommends pausing non-priority arrests until there is capacity in overcrowded jails. Now, you'll know, as regular viewers of Politics Live, that we've covered this story about overcrowded prisons and jails, not enough prison spaces. But, Matt, perhaps you can explain, what's a non-priority arrest?
So, for instance, one of the things that the National Police Chiefs Council is talking about here is big operations that might result in large numbers of arrests. But look, that's the detail. The practical point here is that we shouldn't be in this situation. There's a reason why the government is focusing on expanding those number of prison places. That is a real priority, because we shouldn't be seeing arrests driven by numbers of police places, number of prison places. That cannot be the right metric.
No, but people will be concerned watching the programme when it says, pause non-priority arrests. If you are the victim of a crime, all right, maybe not the most serious crime, but if you're a victim of a crime, you might be alarmed to hear that the person who has committed the crime is not going to be arrested.
No, I agree, and it's important to say this is from the Police Chiefs Council, it's not from the government, but there is no way of spinning this as in any sense a good thing. What it underlines is why that building a prison...
Is government failure?
Well, no, what it underlines is why it is important to deliver that programme that is working through the backlog in the courts and building those great number of prison places.
It was the Conservative Party that in August 2019 said it was going to generate 10,000 more places and spend £2.5 billion on new prisons. So what happened to that?
Well, as I say, that can't come soon enough.
So it didn't happen. And this is another symptom, basically, of the managed decline of the country. I mean, for most people out there, what this is sending is a big signal, which is if you shoplift, if you deal drugs, if you physically assault members of the public or police officers, basically, you're not going to go to prison, you're going to be staying in the community, and we're mainstreaming petty crime and the decline of the quality of British society.
No,
That's essentially what's happening.
It's really important to say, look, you've just used an example. There is no situation here where assaulting a police officer is categorised as not a priority. So I think
assaulting a member of the public.
No, I think it's important to be accurate on what the details of what this is talking about, because I don't think it's fair to alarm the public in any sensible way. But it's also right to say we have to crack on with getting through the backlog in the courts, which is a COVID consequence. We have to crack on with that prison building programme. programme.
Right, what would Labour do? This could be your problem if you win the election, whenever it is.
Well, it won't be our problem because we will absolutely get into addressing the causes of crime. This is something the government has failed to do for 14 years. We don't have youth services across our country. And I'm really pleased that Yvette Cooper has really set out that programme about diverting
Rachel,
people away from crime.
the problem is here and now.
The
These prisons are almost full.
Well, we've got the highest population in prisons that we've had in the whole of the history of this country.
So my question to you is, what would Labour do? You will be faced with the same questions. What would you do on day one to address the fact that the prisons are almost full and police officers are being recommended to stop making arrests?
Well, we certainly won't be taking the foot off the accelerator when it comes to calling people to justice, and that's really important, that we won't be saying, you know, these people have broken the law, but that's OK, because it isn't OK.
So you'll release more people early?
Well, no, we will get a penal system which actually works. So if we look at things like the reoffending rate at the moment, incredibly high, and that is because we aren't putting the resources into the system. But also, we are going to put the police on the streets, which is going to stop the levels of crime that we're seeing in the communities at the moment. 13,000 people across community policing, something our communities are crying out for, taking and de-escalating the levels of antisocial behaviour that we're seeing. Many of these areas which we're talking about, the police shouldn't be arresting for, we will have the people in place to de-escalate, divert and ensure that people are taken on a different pathway.
I mean, Taj, what do you feel about the suggestion of people who have been sentenced to a sentence that's less than 12 months, for example? Should they go to prison or should they do community sentences? Should we increase the number of people who do more in the community than go to prison?
I think we have to look at each crime on its own, but crucially, the real centrepiece of the government's policy over the last more than 10 years has been austerity, and we've seen what's happened to our criminal justice system. It's woefully underfunded. So we can talk about community sentencing, but right now in the prison system, you've got prison officers that are getting abused in these prisons. They are on poor pay and conditions. There's a recruitment crisis of prison officers. And I don't think we're going to solve this by some sort of reform of how many people are being arrested or how many people are being released. Yeah. We have to tackle overcrowding in our prison system. There needs to be more prisons. We need to be actually funding the people that work in this service.
Right, well, Taj is echoing what we heard on the programme last week from a former prison officer who described pretty dire, catastrophic conditions in prisons for both inmates and for prison staff, and particularly this issue of recruitment and the stress, the dangers being faced by prison officers. That's all happened on your party's watch.
I think it's important to say that that upgrade of the prison estate that makes it an easier place in which to do a very difficult job is something that absolutely can't come soon enough, and that has been the government's view for some time. It's about delivering something that was a priority before COVID, continues to be one after.
Matt?
But Matt, the Conservatives came out in August 2019 and said, we're going to spend £2.5 billion fixing this problem, 10,000 more places, build more prisons. It hasn't happened. And, you know, you're supposed to be the party of law and order. Like, you're supposed to be the party of controlled immigration. You're supposed to be the party of fiscal conservatism. None of this stuff is happening. And what worries me about where we are as a country is when you look at how ordinary people are feeling out there and you say, well, who do you trust to manage crime? They just say none of them. Who do you trust to manage immigration? None of them. Who do you trust to manage the economy? None of them. We are in a unique place, I think, in having a political class generally, and people are looking at it and saying, well, no one's got the solutions to these problems. And I'm sure, Labour, you've got ideas. But even when I was listening to you, I was thinking, yes, but what's your solution to the fact that we don't have enough places to send criminals? I mean, this is just basic level stuff for any society.
Well, we've got to look bigger at the problem, haven't we? I mean, we've had 14 years of criminal justice failure. We saw that back in 2011 when we saw 20,000 police officers being cut from our services. And ever since then, we've seen the consequences.
Restored, by the way.
Only just, but we have seen a continuous stream, you know, of the fact that the criminal justice system hasn't had the reforms that are necessary to divert people away from a life of crime and to tackle the causes of crime. That's where Labour's investment will make such a difference. We don't want more and more and more prison places. We don't want people going to prison in the first place. That means about giving people a different trajectory in life and creating the greater equality and opportunities for people in the country. That has not happened for 14 years, and that's why we need the investment in the right places in the system.
But how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it and provide those places?
putting people in prison is an incredibly expensive exercise. So ensuring that we divert that money into more constructive ways. People go to prison to learn how to reoffend even
Rachel,
worse. So putting people in a process where actually they're taken out of a life of crime will cut the costs.
Let's talk about graduate visas, because the Prime Minister has been facing reportedly a cabinet revolt over plans to scrap a graduate visa scheme that allows overseas students to live and work in the UK for up to 2 years after graduation. He was asked about this earlier today. Let's have a listen.
We asked the Independent Migration Advisory Commission to look at the graduate route to make sure that it wasn't being abused, to make sure that people who were coming here to study were then ending up in good, productive jobs that support our economy. They've just provided that report. It came last week, and we're going to take the time to consider their findings carefully.
Well, the Financial Times, we can see in this headline, is reporting that Rishi Sunak backs away from radical reform of graduate visas because it's been criticised by several cabinet ministers for economic reasons and the harm that it would do. Is that the right decision if he's backed away from it?
So I think it's important to strike the right balance on this. So, for instance, I had my local university not far outside my patch, Lincoln, talking about the damage it would do to, for instance, they've got a very successful medical school. They're very keen to expand it. They've got some of that comes from local students, some of their broader courses come from international students. Getting that right is important for UK PLC. What it shouldn't be, and what the Prime Minister doesn't want it to be, is a way for people to come in, stay, having done degrees that don't contribute to that broader economic plan.
Right, but the council report says there hasn't been any abuse of the system, or not that they could see. In other words, the system that the government put in place to allow overseas students to come here and after their studies stay and work is working as it should be.
Indeed, and I think that's why this is a part of
So it was the right decision not to scrap it.
I think that is the right thing if that is where we end up. And as you said, as you heard the Prime Minister talking about considering what they're going to do, that's not the same thing as perfectly confirming everything the FT says. But this is about getting the balance of the overall migration system right. What we want to do is attract people to our great universities rather than to attract people through the wrong routes.
Right, well, you're an academic, Matt. You will know that there are a number of institutions who feel that they could be at risk financially without the numbers of foreign international students coming here, that the attractiveness of coming to study here is not just about the universities, but the fact that you can stay as a foreign student for a couple of years afterwards. They bring in tens of billions of pounds to the economy every year. So is it right to keep it in place, the graduate visa scheme?
No, it's the wrong decision. The university funding model is completely broken. So what's basically happening is the universities are using international student migration to try and plug the holes in a system that doesn't really work. Many of the people coming in on the graduate visa programme, which, by the way, was another legacy of Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings' administration, often go into work where they're earning less than the median wage. They're often going to low-skill, low-wage jobs. They'll come in, they'll do a one-year MA, typically at a non-elite university, second, third-tier university to get into the UK. Well, they'll then move over into the labour market, and they won't just stay for 1 year. They'll often stay for 2, 3, and often push for a lifetime stay while bringing relatives with them. So what we're doing, let's be frank, we've created a Ponzi scheme which is taking more out of Britain's economy than it's putting in. Because when most people think about international students, particularly people in the Financial Times and academics and so on, they think about the nice PhD students studying at Oxbridge. Well, that ain't happening. What we've got are hundreds of thousands of students from Nigeria, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all very, nice people wanting to make the world a better place. But they're coming in, taking more out of the economy overall than they're putting in, which is why, by the way, our GDP per head is so weak. It's why our economy is not really growing.
All right,
because we're just throwing lots of bodies at this economy, hoping that it's going to work. And actually, it isn't. We've created a Deliveroo economy.
George Osborne, since we mentioned him earlier, former Chancellor, said the university sector is a huge asset to the UK economy. He said it would be absolutely ridiculous to damage one of the greatest success stories of the UK economy. Lincoln, for example, might be one of those areas which would really suffer economically as a result.
Yes, but, Jo, this is where we're great at avoiding the really difficult decisions. There are lots of universities in this country that shouldn't be universities. There are lots of universities that should be local vocational technical colleges investing in local British kids. Now, what we're doing instead is we're saying, let's inflate this higher education sector. Let's fill it with as many people as possible, even if they're earning less than the median wage and they're not actually contributing.
We'll come on to some of the more detail, but you represent a university town.
Indeed, two universities in York, and this has had, just even announcing the policy has had a real chilling effect on the number of applicants which are coming from overseas. You cannot pivot an economic model for the rights and the ills of the model to then move to a different system like that for universities. They've got a business model and they need to obviously make the books balance as well. We know that graduates not only put so much into the economy with the skills which they're able to offer, but on top of that, it's also an essential piece of our soft power globally, which is a really important piece of where we sit on the global stage. So it is the right decision that the government has made. It's followed the evidence rather than making an announcement that will scrap it and then
reintroduce. It hasn't followed the evidence. It's the opposite of that.
Introducing a scheme and saying they're going to make an announcement and then doing a U-turn, it would be better if they looked at the evidence first, and that's how we would take a long-term approach at looking at how we make decisions in government, following the evidence, ensuring that we're commissioning, a proper long-term focus on things. But also, what we need to ensure is that we look at the real value this is, not just to home students, but also international students and that wider piece as well.
Matt?
So, first of all, remarkably, the Home Office and other government departments won't even release a lot of the data that we need to track the earnings of people who are coming in and out of the country.
Can I just interrupt just on that point, because you've mentioned it twice. But again, according to Brian Bell, who is, I think, the head of the Migration Advisory Committee who looked at this, he said that actually there wasn't that much evidence, Matt, to suggest that they were earning lower salaries than British students who were graduating. They were also on similar salaries. So this sort of undercutting thing, he didn't think there was evidence of that.
The Migration Advisory Committee previously has been very explicit in their writing in saying that they essentially don't think the graduate route has been created in a way that is supporting a dynamic, growing, innovative economy. And it's very clear when you look...
Except it supports universities.
Some universities, Jo, we have to be more nuanced. I think York, Russell Group, Oxbridge, great universities. I'm a university professor. I'm going to shout from the hilltops, our universities should be supported. But our higher education model, let's just be honest, our higher education model, it's too big, it's broken, and we're using international students to plug the holes because nobody on the left or the right can be bothered to say, actually, this system isn't working anymore, and most of all, it's not working for British kids. Because what we're doing is we're prioritising...
It's not just about education, it's also about the research model, which also feeds into it. And, of course, ensuring that we can power our research, which some of the best in the world and the globe looks to, is important. But we're really poor at that translation and that scaling, which is where the graduates come in, because that's where we need to really build the economic advantage of our universities.
But you talked about the rights and wrongs of the model in terms of the higher education sector. But what's the alternative, Matt? Higher tuition fees for British students, domestic students, or higher taxes to plug the gap left? Maybe that is the right thing, to plug the gap left if there are fewer foreign students coming to study here. I mean, that is the reality, isn't it?
Well, we've had lots of fewer international students in past years. We can make a number of different choices. We could close universities that are on the verge of going bankrupt or already going bankrupt. We could build local community colleges and invest in the things that actually are failing at the moment, like apprenticeships or vocational training or technical training for local adults. Well, we could say that this Ponzi scheme of never-ending expansion of university graduates, by the way, most of whom now the graduate premium is going backwards. Many graduates are working in jobs that don't need university degrees.
I think you'll see within...
And we go round and round in this debate saying more kids into university, more universities, without saying the answer to things like Brexit, levelling up, is changing our economic...
All right, well, let Rachel, I'll come to you, Matt. Labour setting out that plan to ensure that we've got the right skills across the board, because we want to give those technical skills the advance that it should have with it and its rightful place in the economy, because we know we need the spread of skills to make an economy function. And that hasn't been the focus over the last 14 years. We will ensure that we make that investment in those technical colleges, those centres of excellence, where you talk about the local kids can really really get the advantage. I look at the economic footprint in my constituency around the digital creative industry. There is something for everybody in that. The universities working with the colleges, ensuring that we can really power a real economic advantage in that area. That's what we should be doing.
I think it's been a number of years since people have been saying that more people should go to university. What you've seen under the Conservatives, and especially since 2019, is a huge expansion of the apprenticeship programme. A lot of the Levelling Up programme is about investing in local colleges, about investing in further education rather than higher education. I think it's really important to say this is about it has to be about a balanced approach, getting those local vocational qualifications and building on the best universities in the world, many of which are in this country. I'm not quite sure why sort of Matt's brand of sort of patriotism seems to involve talking a lot of that down. We shouldn't be doing that.
All right, well, I'll come back to Taj. Just generally on this graduate visa scheme, is he making the right decision, Rishi Sunak, if he says we're going to keep it?
Yeah, because the thing is, Rishi Sunak is making reforms to the scheme. There is a clampdown on loopholes, and from what I understand, the figures are going down in terms of the amount of people applying for student
They've gone down
visas.
quite significantly already.
One of the reasons we had quite a large number was because of the backlog since COVID. The reality is immigration does make a difference to this country, a very positive contribution. And I think there is absolutely the need for reform in higher education. I think we need more investment in technical colleges and apprenticeships, and I think we do need to invest in the British workforce. But that does not mean that we damage the economy without looking at the evidence, because we want to play to this right-wing aspect of the Conservative Party, who are always talking about immigration, never talking about cost of living, never talking about housing or the NHS. They are distracting from very serious failures from a Conservative government that has no solutions for working-class people.
If you think the Conservative government isn't talking about the NHS, isn't talking about the cost of living, then you're just not listening. That's been the focus for the last 2, 3, 4 years.
I'm sort of still getting over being accused of patriotism by a Conservative MP. But the underlying issue is the Conservative Party in 2019 promised Britain a high-skill, controlled immigration policy. What the Conservative Party delivered was a low-skill, uncontrolled immigration policy, which is why the party has lost so many of its 2019 voters. This isn't rocket science. That's what's happened.
Right, well, we may see some manifestos coming along shortly. Let's just have a look at this headline. BBC News, MPs and peers call for Gaza visa scheme. Rachel, you're one of those MPs. Tell us, one of 50, I think, MPs and peers calling for a visa scheme to enable family members of Palestinians in Gaza to come to the UK and join them. What are you asking for precisely?
Well, obviously, at the moment, we've got the most horrendous situation in Gaza, and we all recognise that. We obviously see it on our screens, not living and breathing the horrific day-to-day experience of people in the region there. And when we have constituents who come to us and say, we've got family, we've got children who are trapped in Gaza, we want to be reunited like any family would. I've got constituents, 2 children and his wife are in Gaza at the moment. He would have been eligible to bring his family to the UK. He's invited to study here by the British Council in the UK. And yet the government is saying, well, they can come, but there is no mechanism by which they can. So they can't get biometrics taken. They can't go to Egypt to get those biometrics because they can't leave the region. Therefore,
as far as you're concerned, have any Palestinian refugees from Gaza been able to come here?
There is no scheme in place, per se. So I've kind of cross-examined the government and saying there's an injustice here. And it was incredible what our country did in supporting people from Ukraine. And we recognise the importance of that. And yet when it comes to Gaza, there's an inequality there.
Why is that, Matt?
So I think it's interesting the point that Rachel makes, where someone who is entitled to come but physically is not able to do the things that tick the box.
Well, in other words, they can't come.
Yeah, so there is clearly a sort of huge contradiction there, and I think without wishing to steal Rachel's thunder, I think it's good that I think you're meeting a minister later on today to try and talk about this stuff. I think the government clearly, on the one hand, vitally important to say Israel has the right to defend itself. All of the bigger stuff around Gaza is what sits over this.
But you'd like to see a specific scheme for Gaza?
Well, I think there are obviously real human beings at the heart of this crisis. If there is a situation where they are in theory entitled to come but in practice unable to, that should be resolved as quickly as possible.
Matt Goodwin, you've said you don't want to see a visa scheme for Gazans. Why?
Lots of reasons. The first is most British people don't support it. We've seen polling over the last few weeks which shows that. I begin and end with the principle of popular sovereignty. Yeah, YouGov, most Brits say we don't have a moral obligation. I've also polled Brits and they're not supportive of a specific scheme. Secondly, I don't really think it's on us to solve every refugee issue around the world. After Hong Kong, after Ukraine, after Afghanistan, we've taken hundreds of thousands. Thirdly, security services and others have been very open in saying that this is potentially quite a serious security risk. We've got very high levels of support for Hamas, got very high levels of support for ideas that I don't think are compatible with British ways of life. If I can finish, we've also had a study in Denmark. What happened in Denmark when Denmark took large numbers of Palestinian refugees? What happened?
But these are people. But hang on, these are people who've got family members here. We'll get into some of your hang on. We'll get into some of your criticisms. Yeah, you can in a minute. But let me just get Taj. Let me just get Taj to respond broadly.
Also have relatives in the UK around the world. Hundreds of millions.
Sure. To your first point, which is that Matt doesn't think that there is popular support for the idea.
Well, popular support is never going to be an indicator of what's the moral decision. Let's look at Gaza. The vast majority of Palestinians who live in Gaza are already refugees. Many of them were expelled from their homeland. And if you last week marked the 76th anniversary of the Nakba, the catastrophe, where 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their home, 500 villages were destroyed. So now we've got Palestinians who are seeing the carpet bombing of hospitals. Remember that half of Gaza's population are children. They weren't even alive when Hamas was elected.
But does that mean that the UK should take many more, if any at all, Palestinian refugees, the Gazan refugees you're talking about here?
Absolutely. I think there is a moral obligation. If you look at Britain's colonial history in the region, Britain has played a role in what's happening in Palestine. And you can't have it both ways. You cannot cheerlead a genocide in Gaza. You cannot destabilise regions across the world and then complain about refugees.
I don't think anyone's cheerleading a genocide. Hang on, Matt,
mainstream politics is cheerleading a genocide.
They are supporting what Israel is doing, and we continue to arm Israel while they are massacring civilians.
In what sense is that cheerleading a genocide? That's an incredibly offensive thing to say.
It might be offensive to hear it, but it is true. And
so
Palestinians,
who is doing it?
35,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and our government have refused to act.
But answer the question, because to accuse people of cheerleading of genocide is, I can understand why the politicians would be offended, but who is cheerleading?
When Keir Starmer went on LBC and said Israel was justified in cutting off food, water and electricity to a civilian population, which is known as collective punishment under international law, I found that deeply offensive.
Well, let Rachel respond to that.
I think we're all very disturbed by that statement, but he stood back from it, and now Labour's got a very clear position on Gaza, and that's really important. But what this scheme, just returning back to the issue in question, what this scheme is very limited, short period. And of course, the bigger call is we want a ceasefire. We want the killing to stop. We don't want there to be a scheme because we want the collective community to say enough is enough. Let's start building the peace, not the war. But whilst this horrific situation is going on in Gaza at the moment, we have got an obligation to the people that we've invited to our country, that are here rightfully in our country, to say we're not going to deny you of having a family life, and we want to bring your families together. Your little children who are ducking the bombs at the moment, we want to bring them to a place of safety with you. Any father would want that for their child, and we want to be able to deliver that.
I mean, how clear are you in your mind, Matt, that the security risks, presumably because you and others feel that many Gazans, we don't know how many, might have sympathy with
we do know
Hamas.
how many.
Well,
We've got
the polling is not clear. It is disputed. I'm not going to go into message, but I've read. I know, but I've read all. I've read all of the polling, and it isn't clear. We are talking about children joining families here. So, how great is the security risk that you are talking about?
Well, I take security services seriously, and
children.
I think. Can I finish? I've been interrupted.
Yeah, go on.
I take the warnings of security services seriously when we talk about cheerleading. I think there are lots of people in this country, lots of British Jews included, who have been sick of 6 months of watching cheerleading on Britain's streets for Hamas, Islamist extremists and terrorists, and do not want to open the door to more people into this country who similarly sympathise with what is, according to our own government, by the way, an extremist terrorist organisation. Why can't Egypt do more? Why can't Jordan do more?
Jordan has 1.8 million Palestinians in Jordan at the moment. 1.8 million.
What about other neighbouring countries in the area?
Well,
Why
let me go to Taj. What do you say
Why
about
Britain?
the security risks? Do you admit these are legitimate concerns? Hamas is deemed a terrorist organisation. Its stated aim is to destroy Israel and to create not a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli or Jewish state, but to actually replace it. Do you think those are legitimate concerns for people here if there was a scheme that would bring over Gazan refugees?
Hamas is a political party. One of the reasons
It's an extremist organisation.
OK, and it's a political party.
It's also deeply anti-Semitic.
Okay. Yes, OK. Now, Hamas was elected in Gaza. One of the reasons they were supported was because of welfare programmes, and Fatah was seen as a very corrupt party, and many people supported Hamas.
Fatah in charge in the West Bank,
Indeed.
in a different part of the area. Yeah.
Now, the reality is this. We are talking about millions of Palestinians. We never make generalisations. And if we're talking about a population where half of whom are children, are you really saying to me a 10-year-old Palestinian who might be severely injured, who might need urgent medical treatment, is a threat to this country? I think we have counter-terrorism laws in this country to make sure that we have...
Why is a 10-year-old Palestinian going to be a threat?
I think, as I say, I think the underlying principle of taking more people into Britain from Palestine, from Gaza,
Palestinian child, not a single Palestinian child where you could save a life. What crime has a Palestinian child committed?
We can get very abstract about it.
It's not abstract.
This is central to the issue because we're talking about children. We're talking about bringing children to reunite them with their families.
I'm not going to be bullied by liberal tears on this one, OK? I would say, how about neighbouring countries do a bit more?
I find that's an abhorrent statement.
How about neighbouring countries...
Don't all talk over each other, Matt. Don't shout over everyone.
Do a little bit more, because you know what I care about? I care about the British Jewish community. How do they feel opening the door to more Palestinians, to people who are supportive of Hamas?
They're not.
The downplaying of Hamas on this show, by the way, is outrageous. It's an extremist Islamist organisation. The marching, the expression of sympathy for Hamas in this country has been outrageous. And I would expect Labour, after everything you went through with Jeremy Corbyn, just to be a little bit more sensitive on this issue and stick up for British Jews.
Let Rachel speak.
OK. We are talking about children coming to this country, children who have got nothing. They have been moved from place to place in Gaza at the moment. They are coming to be with their mother or their father who are here in the UK. A very limited scheme for a short period of time until the horrific bombing of Gaza comes to an end. These are innocent civilians. These aren't people who are terrorists. These are people that want to be with their mummy and daddy and to have some sort of life. And I'm afraid that is the reality of what we are asking for.
Right, let me just ask Matt, would you support that?
So I think that sort of scheme is as Rachel says, is a very limited thing. I do think it's important in this debate overall to say, look, there are, of course, very real concerns around immigration, around what other countries can do, all of that. Britain, nonetheless, has that hugely proud track record around particularly Ukraine that attracted enormous public support. And it is a very dangerous thing, I think, to say that we will never have a duty to other countries again.
Well, something that has happened today but has been discussed over months and years is this in the Financial Times, not Israel recalling the envoys, but the fact that Spain, Ireland and Norway commit to recognise a Palestinian state. Matt, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it's their decision. I mean, they're individual nation states. They can choose whatever they want to say. I don't personally think that's a good idea, but that's my personal politics.
Right. Taj?
Yeah, I think it's long overdue. I think we need to be thinking about solutions here. You know, how do we find a way forward? When you look at the current state of Gaza at the moment, and you see that the vast majority of the residential buildings have been destroyed, we talk about Hamas and how much of a threat they pose. How do you address an issue like Hamas? Do you address that by
Well, just before, I just want to...
After the war?
I'd allow the Palestinian people to make their mind up.
All right. Hang on, Matt. Let me go to the politicians. What do you make? Should the UK do the same and recognise a Palestinian state?
I'd say absolutely yes, because we've got to now look at how we build the peace and step back from this horrific situation at the moment. We can't have more continuous killing. We have got to start rebuilding, and you start by rebuilding the politics.
The UK, hang on,
and therefore you start rebuilding the political institutions of...
It's true. No detail has been worked out, and there's disagreement in Israel within the cabinet, and Benjamin Netanyahu is under pressure to come forward with an after-war plan. But in the midst of this, would you support the idea of the UK government doing the same as Spain, Ireland and Norway?
So I think what we need to get to, what everyone thinks we need to get to in the end, is a two-state solution. And once you have achieved, and it feels a very long way away now, but once you have achieved that two-state solution, that would be the time to recognise both states. I think what we risk doing in actions like this is interjecting additional problems into the region and the diplomacy around it.
We've got Prime Minister's question, sorry to interrupt, in just over 5 minutes' time. Let's have a look inside the chamber as MPs are gathering, because we understand that the Conservative MP, Craig Mackinlay, he's the Conservative MP for South Thanet, is set to return to Parliament today for the very first time, because we can show you pictures of Craig Mackinlay after being operated on. He nearly died from sepsis at the end of last year. You can see here that he is and has been back on his feet, but he has lost both his hands and both his feet. Incredible images here of him managing to get about in his own house, his own garden with his family. He said he is lucky to be alive, but let's have a listen to him.
You don't realise how much you do with your hands. That dexterity is just amazing. To use your phone, hold the hand of your child, touch your wife, do the gardening. It's all these things, or cooking, and I love cooking. I mean, I'm hoping with these, amazing things, I'll be able to get somewhere towards it.
I mean, very dramatic images there of Craig Mackinlay, and what a battle for survival. Well, he's going to make his way, if he hasn't already, into the Commons chamber. He'll be sitting alongside the front bench. We're expecting the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, to talk about his return to Parliament. And interestingly, he has said, certainly so far, that he is intending to stand again at the next election, whenever that will be. But some reaction. I don't know how well you know Craig.
I mean, the last time I saw Craig, we were having a drink on the terrace of the House of Commons. It's such an extraordinary... I think people often forget that politics is... we all see each other. We're all human beings. And to see Craig coming back after all that he's been through is just extraordinary. It's sort of bravery and courage. And I think everyone, whatever side of the House they're on, they're all going to want to see him back and firing on all cylinders.
I mean, it started, he said, in September. End of September, he started to feel unwell. Here he is. In fact, we can see him being cheered in. Let's have a listen. Well, it's incredibly emotional. We may hear Sir Lindsay Hoyle say something, so let's just wait and pause a moment. But what an emotional welcome for Craig Mackinlay there. You can see, moved to tears, understandably, and all MPs on their feet for his bravery.
As you know, we don't allow a clapping, but this is an exception. Right, Minister.
Me just to say welcome back to the honourable friend for South Thanet.
Well, he's being welcomed back there by the Minister and all MPs. Quite extraordinary scenes, actually. I mean, the Speaker's right. Clapping is not encouraged or not even allowed inside the chamber, but this really is an exception, and quite rightly, Craig Mackinlay taking his moment there to return and looking incredibly well when you think of what's happened to him, losing 4 limbs and learning to walk again with prosthetic feet and ankles and hands as well.
Quite phenomenal. And I used to work as a physiotherapist, so seeing somebody return with such function is amazing. But he's also coming back to take a stand on sepsis and to really drive that agenda. How incredible is that? And we know sepsis is on the rise, so I'm sure his advocacy in that space will be so powerful because of his lived experience, and I look forward to working alongside him.
Right. Well, also he's met the Speaker already before coming back into the chamber. We can see here him going in to see... Oh, here he is with his family. as he comes in, no doubt, to the Speaker's rooms to meet Sir Lindsay Hoyle. This will all have been long prepared and choreographed, and obviously waiting for the moment when Craig Mackinlay was well enough to come in. A testament, isn't it, Matt, really, to an individual person's resilience and determination.
It really is. It's an unbelievable story. I mean, the courage, determination, resilience that comes across in the interviews. The piece that I read in I think it was the Telegraph, was unbelievable. I haven't stopped thinking about it since. And he just comes across, I mean, he's a very nice guy. I mean, he just sort of got on with it. I mean, he was kind of making jokes about his predicament. It was sort of like the best of British in a way. But hats off to him. And his wife, by the way, as well, who really, from all accounts, seems to have just really stood by him the whole way.
Well, and as Rachel was saying, Taj, I mean, sepsis is a really, really dangerous condition. It's recognised a bit more these days than it was because of some of the tragedies that we've heard as a result. And as he said himself there, Craig Mackinlay, he is lucky to still be alive.
It's very worrying. I think we were hearing about a rise in sepsis, and I think it just understates the importance of having the National Health Service, and what a privilege that we do have a system like that for whatever, there are many faults, but at least we've got that protection there. And so, yeah, I think, seeing what's been happening, it does hit home.
Well, and I understand being told that the prosthetics he has got, which look amazing, he had to acquire those privately because they are not available on the NHS. I mean, that will be something that will be at the thoughts of many, many people who could, hopefully not, find themselves in a similar situation.
Yeah. And people, I think people are absolutely right. So, look, the NHS does amazing things, and for Craig to be in the position that he's in is not the one that any of us would wish ourselves to be in.
Right. I mean, he said, Craig Mackinlay, that he got amazing care on the NHS, but the prosthetics were not up to the standard you can see
well,
there.
Incredible advance in medical technology too. So,
let's just hear a bit more from the Speaker.
Craig, it's so good to have you back amongst us. You are the man of the moment, and I met your daughter, who is going to be the daughter of the month with her birthday tomorrow. So can I say to you and your family, it is an inspiration to people in this country who've suffered with sepsis. You have shown us the way forward. Thank you for everything. And that's the only reason I allow clapping. Can also, just to mention, we've got the Speaker of the Icelandic Parliament with us today and the Premier of the Cayman Islands. We now go over to questions to the Prime Minister, Jen Kitchen.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 1.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will join me in remembering the victims of the horrific Manchester Arena bombing 7 years ago today. Our thoughts are with them and their families. And I'd like to pay tribute to Figen Murray, who joins us in the gallery for her courage and her bravery of her campaigning in her son Martin's memory, and I look forward to meeting her later today too. Mr. Speaker, can I also add my personal welcome back to Parliament to my friend and colleague, the Honourable Member for South Fanning. No one who watched his interview last night could have failed to have been in awe of his incredible resilience. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jen Kitchen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome the Honourable Member for South Fanning back to the House and wish him well in his duties. Can I also associate my remarks with the Prime Minister? The Association of Dental Groups in their May 2022 report identified my constituency, Wellingborough, as one of England's dental deserts. I welcomed the Prime Minister's grand scheme to send dental vans to constituencies like mine. But just months on, he's having to U-turn because there aren't enough vans. Why can't the Minister address this issue seriously?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not right. Actually, thanks to our dental recovery plan, we're delivering 2.5 million more dental appointments. There's a new patient premium, new provision for remote communities, and actually, we know that the plan is now delivering because since it was announced in January, over 500 more dental practices are now accepting new patients. And I'd also just point out to the Honourable Lady that compared to the party opposite's plan, what we are doing is producing more than twice the number of extra appointments to get people the treatment they need.
Elliot Colburn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's news on inflation is not just good news for consumers in Carshalton and Wallington, but also for capital projects like the investment into St Helier Hospital and to build a second hospital in my constituency, protecting A&E and maternity locally. Given that good news on the economy, will the Prime Minister recommit today to working with the NHS in my area to build that second hospital, improve St Helier Hospital, and agree that you can only underpin a strong NHS with a strong economy?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, we are investing in better healthcare right across our country, and I'm delighted to see that Epsom and St Helier University NHS Trust was recently allocated over £6 million to upgrade the A&E and will benefit from a new specialist emergency care hospital in Sutton as part of the programme. But as my honourable friend said, that is only possible because of the difficult decisions we have taken to bring inflation back to normal and grow the economy. Today's figures show that the plan is working, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the whole House, including perhaps the Leader of the Opposition, will welcome the news that inflation is now back to normal.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
I want to begin by saying a few words to the honourable member for Thanet South. Firstly, thank you for meeting me privately this morning with your wife and daughter so I could personally convey my best wishes to all of you. Secondly, on some occasions, and there aren't many, this House genuinely comes together as one, and we do so today to pay tribute to your courage and determination in not only coming through an awful ordeal, but by being here today with us in this chamber. And thirdly, I want to acknowledge your deep sense of service. I think politics is about service. And resuming your duties as an MP, being here today, shows us it's an example for all of us of your deep sense of service. And we thank you for it. I also welcome Figan Murray, who is up in the gallery. She lost her son, Martin, 7 years ago today in the Manchester Arena attacks, and we remember everybody who was lost in that awful attack. She's campaigning for Martin's Law, which we must make a reality as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, the infected blood scandal reflects a profound failure across almost every part of the British state. On Monday in our apologies and yesterday on the question of compensation, this House was united. But too many times we've heard similar sentiments from that dispatch box and from this one. There are many hard yards to go. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that we will only now make real progress if we finally tackle the lack of openness, transparency and candour that Sir Brian Langstaff identified as having prolonged the victim's suffering for decades?
Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The inquiry was established to get to the truth and provide answers, and this week's report represented a hugely significant moment for the community. This was an appalling scandal, and I think the whole House is grateful to the diligent work of all those who have supported Sir Brian Langstaff and the inquiry's work. And I also pay tribute to the bravery of every individual who has come forward and told their story in their fight for justice. Their voices have now finally been heard, and I agree with the honourable gentleman. We will listen to them and ensure that nothing like this can ever happen in our country again.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The infected blood scandal is shocking, truly shocking, but it's not unique. The story is familiar. Concerns raised but ignored, reports written but not acted on, victims and their families campaigning for years just to be heard. So I want to focus in, if I may, on the duty of candour, or lack of it, which has been a failing in scandal after scandal, injustice after injustice, from Grenfell to Horizon, Hillsborough, and now infected blood. And I've read the government has called for evidence about the duty of candour in health, but I can't think of a single example where that duty of candour should not apply to all public servants across the board. And I don't think it's possible for any of us to stand at these dispatch boxes and honestly say, never again, unless we address it. So does the Prime Minister agree that the time has now come for the duty of candour to be clearly enshrined in law across the board?
Mr. Speaker, I am, of course, aware of the recommendation made by Sir Brian Langstaff in the final report of the inquiry in relation to duties of candour and accountability, and indeed my honourable friend previously introduced the duty of candour into the health service. It is important that the government takes time to fully digest the gravity of the findings of the report. The wrongs which have been committed are devastating and life-altering for so many. Ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again is a priority, and of course we are sympathetic to that and going through the recommendations in detail at the moment before providing a comprehensive response. But of course, given the situation and the gravity of the findings, it's a recommendation that there is an enormous amount of sympathy for.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you. I understand the Prime Minister wants to look at the recommendations in detail and to come back to them in due course. But we can't look away on this duty of candour. So can I at least ask the Prime Minister to expand the call for evidence on the duty of candour beyond health? We do owe that to the victims of Hillsborough and Horizon. And to work across the House to establish a far-reaching and binding duty of candour just as quickly as possible.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman will remember on Monday I said very specifically that the patterns and behaviour that we had seen in this appalling tragedy have been replicated in others, and I mentioned Hillsborough specifically. So I'm very aware that there are structural and behavioural cultural problems that we do need to fix. The duty of candour is something that, as I said, the principle, and there is an enormous amount of support for the principle of and sympathy for. He will understand we are digesting the full contents of the report, but of course we want to right the wrongs of the past and crucially ensure that nothing like this happens ever again.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his report, Sir Brian identified individual failures, a number of them, even cover-ups. But alongside that, he also found equally important and harder to reach institutional and cultural failings, including in the NHS. A defensive attitude which refused to acknowledge problems, the silencing of those who raised concerns, and a total failure of leadership when faced with the truth. Now, the NHS does a remarkable job every day, but that is indefensible. Does the Prime Minister agree that the very culture of the NHS needs to change?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and again, I think in response specifically to the question from my honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove, we discussed this on Monday, and the NHS, of course, provides life-saving care to so many people every single day, for which we're enormously grateful. But it is absolutely clear, as the report makes crystal clear, that there were significant failings. The NHS failed. It failed people, it let them down. It's right that they are held accountable for that and learn the lessons. Now, there clearly have been improvements and changes in medical practice since that time, but going forward, we need to go through the full recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff's report and hold the NHS to account for bringing through the changes that are necessary.
Yes,
we need reform, we need change, and I've seen firsthand how important reform is during my time running the Crown Prosecution Service. But I also saw how hard it is, particularly on cultural issues. It requires brave decisions and difficult decisions. Now, 11 years ago, the Health Secretary, as Health Secretary, the now Chancellor said, the era of gagging NHS staff from raising their worries about patient care must come to an end. But 11 years on and 10 months on from the Lucy Letby case, there are still clear examples of NHS managers still gagging staff and then being moved on instead of being moved out. So will the Prime Minister now commit to ensuring that those who do gag and silence whistleblowers will no longer be able to work in the NHS?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course the behaviour that the honourable gentleman describes is wrong and I believe already is illegal under our laws, but we will make sure that people do have the ability to raise concerns. And one thing that I know has given many of those who have been impacted by this scandal some reassurance is the appointment of Sir Robert Francis to be chair of the inquiry, who obviously is someone who not just has a wealth of experience dealing with this particular set of issues, but has a long track record of working with the NHS as well on the issues that the honourable gentleman raises.
Keir Starmer.
Sir Brian's report is a victory for all those campaigners and victims who fought so hard for this moment. including the Right Honourable Member for Hull North. But it's also one of profound pain, anger and sadness for so many. Now, there is a chance for us to make real progress on this issue, and we must do that with victims in mind. Now, given the degree of cross-party consensus that we've already seen on apologies and compensation, and given the government's promise to ensure compensation by the end of the year, will he also now promise to deliver on all the recommendations in the same timeframe by the end of the year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we want to deliver on the recommendations as quickly as practically possible, and indeed our expectation is that we can do that before the end of the year. But Sir Robert's appointment, as I said, will bring a wealth of experience, and it was crucial that the Chair had the knowledge and the expertise and familiarity with the issues here. His support for delivering the scheme and making sure that compensation can be paid by the end of the year, I think, will be invaluable. He talked about the community, and over the next few weeks, Sir Robert will seek views from the infected blood community, specifically on the proposed scheme, to make sure that the scheme will best serve those it is intended for. And our shared priority is delivering compensation to all those infected and affected with absolutely minimum delay, and begin bringing justice to all of those impacted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 1997, the public voted in what they were told would be a sort of continuity Conservative government, the same policies, just with different faces. Instead, what they got was record immigration, constitutional vandalism and a broken economy. Does the Prime Minister agree that with the economy now roaring back to life under a Conservative government, the last thing we need is a return to the failed Labour recipe of high taxes, open borders and employment laws that destroy jobs?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend gives a superb and passionate economic diagnosis, and he's right. Inflation is now back to normal, and indeed lower than France, Germany, the United States, at its lowest level in years. Our economy is growing faster, wages are rising, and that's why we need to stick to the plan that is working, Mr. Speaker. And he's right to point out the risks of what the Labour Party proposed. 70 new laws, 70 new laws. They've caved in to their union paymasters, and what does that mean? It means it will cost jobs and damage our economic recovery.
MP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I begin by also welcoming the member from South Thanet back to the chamber. He is indeed an inspiration to all of us. Mr. Speaker, speculation is rife, so I think the public deserve a clear answer to a simple question. Does the Prime Minister intend to call a summer general election, or is he feared?
Mr. Speaker, as I have said repeatedly to him, there is, Mr. Speaker, spoiler alert, there is going to be a general election in the second half of this year, and at that moment, the British people will in fact see the truth about the honourable gentleman opposite me, because that will be the choice at the next election, Mr. Speaker. A party that is not able to say to the country what they would do, a party that would put at risk our hard-earned economic stability, or the Conservatives that are delivering a secure future for our United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, he continues to play games with the public, but whilst he does that, let's get back to some serious matters. Because I was taken aback this week when a former Prime Minister spoke some sense. Alas, it was indeed David Cameron, because what he said was that in relation to graduate route visas, if any restrictions are implemented, it will lead to job losses, it will lead to university closures, it will lead to a reduction in research. And University Scotland's outlines £5 billion of economic value at risk. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he agree with the Foreign Secretary?
The Foreign Secretary also said that the levels of legal migration to this country are too high, Mr. Speaker, and that's what I believe also, which is why it is right that we are taking decisive action to bring the numbers down. And, Mr. Speaker, that plan is working. In the first 3 months of this year, the visas issued are down by 25%, Mr. Speaker. Migration is on its way to being returned to more sustainable levels, and I appreciate that is a point of difference between the Honourable Gentleman's Party and indeed the Labour Party and us. We believe that level of migration needs to come down to more sustainable levels, so we ease the pressure on public services, and everyone who comes to our country must indeed contribute economically. That's the migration system we will deliver.
Simon Bain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the Welsh borders, we're incredibly proud of the Veterans Centre at the Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt Orthopaedic Hospital in North Shropshire, which not only treats veterans locally, including from my constituency of Clwyd South, but also from across Britain, as it is the largest hospital-based veterans service in the UK. Would the Prime Minister help resolve the Centre's current funding crisis, caused by changes in the NHS funding formula last year, given the fantastic treatment provided by Lieutenant Carl Mayer and his team for our amazing veterans community across the UK?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue? We are committed to making the UK the best place in the world to be a veteran and ensuring that they have access to the appropriate physical and mental health support they deserve. That's why we've rolled out Operation Restore, Op Courage and Op Nova, and I know that NHS England have been introducing actually a suite of health services to work more closely with orthopaedic services. But I know my honourable friend has raised this issue of funding with the Minister of Veteran Affairs, and he'll be writing back to my honourable friend with an update in due course.
David. I join others in welcoming back to the House the Honourable Member for South Thanet and say how much we admire his courage and send our best wishes to him and his family. And also join others in remembering all the victims of the bombing at Manchester Arena. Mr. Speaker, Amanda claimed carer's allowance when caring for her mother, but the DWP is now hounding her to pay back £1,200. Karina, whose daughter requires round-the-clock care, has been hit by a bill for £11,000. Victoria is being forced to pay back £100 a month. Just some of the tens of thousands of carers, victims of the DWP's flawed system, punished harshly for going sometimes just a few pounds over the arbitrary earnings limit. So, Mr. Speaker, family carers do a remarkable job. They shouldn't be penalised for working or for the DWP's own failures. So does the Prime Minister agree that the government should be supporting carers, not persecuting them?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the government recognises the contribution and sacrifices that carers up and down the country so often make to care for others, and that's why we've increased carers' allowance by almost £1,500 since 2010. It's why we introduced carers' leave, and indeed it's why the Better Care Fund funds respite care breaks for carers, which have been, I know, warmly welcomed and used. Now, in the rare number of cases where individuals haven't appropriately informed DWP about a change in their circumstances, DWP have then rightly sought to recover overpayments, as they would be expected to, in order to ensure the integrity of the system and protecting the taxpayer. But of course, they will work with anyone who is struggling with their repayment terms and will always look to negotiate an affordable repayment plan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I also extend my welcome to the Honourable Member for Thanet South. The £8 billion made available by the Government for the repair of roads and potholes is very welcome. However, some local authorities, such as Cambridgeshire County Council and Peterborough City Council, which serve my constituency, sometimes use inferior material, so the works need to be done again in a few months' time. And that's an issue that applies to many constituencies across the country. So will the Prime Minister use his influence to ensure that there are tough quality specifications so that the repairs can last much longer?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we've announced an additional £8 billion for roads resurfacing over the next decade, money made available through the reallocation of HS2 fundings, and that will mean fewer potholes and smoother, safer roads across our country. But I agree with my right honourable friend. It is of the utmost importance that these repairs are completed with high-quality materials, and I join him in calling on Cambridgeshire County Council and Peterborough Council to make sure that they deliver that for his residents.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the wee small hours of Saturday morning, I received an email, and I apologise for my language, Mr Speaker, calling me a fucking parasite, a rat and a piece of shit. This came in response to my challenging the appropriateness of a US citizen, Michael Francesi, who is doing a tour in the UK and as part of that tour advocating publicly for the self-proclaimed misogynist influencers Andrew and Tristan Tate, who are encouraging toxic attitudes among young men in this country. Can I ask the Prime Minister, who has spoken about banning hate preachers from entering the UK, if he will extend this to misogynists?
Mr Speaker, those who seek to divide us, undermine our values and indeed intimidate and threaten others have no place in our society, and we will not hesitate to use not just the full force of the law but also our immigration regime to make sure we have security and cohesion in this country.
Sir John Whittington.
Mr Speaker, the population of Malden is rising rapidly, and for over 20 years my constituents have been promised a new hospital. Yet Mid and South Essex ICB are now proposing to close the existing St Peter's Hospital without any replacement, leaving my constituents and those of my right honourable friend for Whittam having to travel up to 30 miles for some treatments. Will my right honourable friend ask ministers to tell the ICB to withdraw this proposal and to commission an independent assessment of how best to provide quality local health services that my constituents and my right friends deserve?
Prime Minister. Can I commend my honourable friend for his commitment to his constituents? I know that he and my honourable friend, the member for Witham, met both the Minister of State for Health and Secondary Care and the Minister for Social Care recently to discuss this. I understand that the ICB have extended their consultation by 3 weeks to ensure that more consideration could be given and voices could be heard, but I will ensure that the relevant minister keeps my right honourable friend updated on the progress of this.
John Davey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent has recently applied to move from her council home because she can no longer walk up the stairs and she is in constant pain. She has been waiting for a knee operation for over 2 years and she has become progressively worse. She feels forgotten and neglected. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that his government is failing and this country is waiting for a Labour government to bring down NHS waiting lists?
Mr Speaker, of course, I'm sorry to hear about the experience of the honourable lady's constituent, and we are putting more money, rolling out more elective surgical hubs to bring the waiting list down. She talks about the difference that the Labour Party would make to the NHS. Her constituents would just look to Wales to see what is happening when it comes to the NHS. A quarter of the Welsh population on a waiting list. The worst emergency care performance in Great Britain. People on long waiting lists 5 times more than they are in England, and on average, people waiting 40% longer for treatment. That's the reality of Labour in the NHS, failing.
40 years ago, Mrs Thatcher described high inflation as a destroyer of industry, of jobs and savings. Does my right honourable friend agree that that sentiment is as true today as it was then? And what assessment does he make of today's announcement for my Gedling constituents who want to be able to save, get a good job and enjoy a reasonable standard cost of living?
Well, my honourable friend is right that today does mark a major moment for the economy. Not only have we halved inflation, but it has returned back to normal thanks to the collective hard work and sacrifice and resilience of people up and down the country. And this is further proof that our plan is working. Mortgage rates have come down, energy bills have come down, taxes are being cut, and inflation now back to normal. That shows that when you stick to the plan, we can look forward to a brighter future. But my honourable friend is right to point out the alternative. Labour Party imposing £2,000 of tax rises. That's what the country would put stability at risk.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. England's Chief Medical Officer said that reducing sewage in rivers and seas is a public health priority,
It is.
highlighting the problems dumping untreated sewage causes. Even the treated sewage, which is continuously discharged into rivers and seas, contains faecal matter. Water firms are now asking for bills to go up by up to 91% when they've paid out billions to shareholders and neglected pipework, and infrastructure. So, Mr Speaker, can the Prime Minister tell me why is his government allowing these companies to destroy our waterways and make obscene levels of profit whilst making people ill?
Well, Mr Speaker, the level of overflows we've seen is unacceptable, but we have gone further than any other government, monitoring 100% of overflows, up from only 7% under Labour, investing record amounts in our water infrastructure, enshrining in law strict targets and introducing unlimited fines for water companies to hold them to account. But when it came to this House, the party opposite couldn't even vote for their own policy. And that's because there's only one party with a plan to protect the environment, the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Our NHS needs to be at the cutting edge of innovation and transformation. So I very much welcome the recent announcement on artificial intelligence in the delivery of radiotherapy. But will my right honourable friend commit to us going further and faster in the rollout and realising the potential of AI and the latest, most innovative medtech across our NHS, benefiting, of course, patients but also clinicians?
Prime Minister. I agree with my honourable friend that we need to ensure our NHS is a world leader in medical innovation, which is why yesterday we announced funding to roll out game-changing AI to radiotherapy departments in England. And the benefits are clear because that technology can locate cancer cells 2.5 times quicker than doctors alone. But we won't stop there. We recognise the huge potential, and that's why the productivity plan announced in the spring budget will modernise the NHS and ensure our patients get the care that they deserve.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In recent days, the Trussell Trust revealed that its network handed out more than 3.1 million emergency food parcels in the past year, and that's the most it's ever distributed and nearly double the number 5 years ago. Absolute poverty among children in this country has risen by its highest rate of 30 years, and 1/4 of all children in this country live below that poverty line. 2/3 of UK children in poverty live in families where at least one parent works. My constituency, Streatham, is one of the worst affected. So, Mr Speaker, does the Prime Minister have any plans to restore the Child Poverty Unit or to address the calls for universal free school meals or report on any government plans aimed at tackling child poverty at all?
Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, nobody wants to see any child grow up in poverty, and that's why I'm pleased that the record of this and previous governments has reduced not just the number of people living in poverty, but the number of children living in poverty, thanks to our measures to strengthen the economy. But when it comes to supporting children who are vulnerable with their food, we've extended the Holiday Activity and Food Programme with £200 million of funding, and we're investing £30 million in our National School Breakfast Programme, which will now run until the end of the summer term.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The best ways of helping people with the cost of living is to cut their taxes, keep unemployment low and get inflation down. Things this government are doing. What is the Prime Minister's assessment of how the very welcome news of today's reduction in inflation going to help both businesses and families with the costs they face?
Well, Mr Speaker, my honourable friend is exactly right in his analysis of how to help working families and our country. And thanks to the difficult decisions we have taken, inflation today is back to normal, which is a very welcome moment. Of course, there's more work to do. Of course, people are only just starting to feel the benefits, but it's clear that the plan is working. And that's why we have also been able to deliver significant tax cuts worth £900 to the average worker in our country. This is all progress that would absolutely be put at risk by the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Harland and Wolff is an iconic cornerstone of the UK's future shipbuilding, defence and energy capabilities. Harland and Wolff has saved 4 shipyards from administration, invested millions, and now employs 1,500 workers across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, many of whom are my constituents. Approval of the company's export development guarantee is crucial to consolidate this progress. Will the Prime Minister ensure that this is achieved?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The government is committed to supporting the UK shipbuilding sector right across the nation, and I've seen firsthand what companies like Harland and Wolff and the role that they play in the economy. Whilst you'll understand I can't comment specifically on the details of any individual case due to commercial sensitivity, I can assure him that we are working closely with Harland and Wolff in their request for a UKEF guaranteed loan. It is under consideration, and can I also pay tribute to the right honourable member for East Belfast for all he does to be a strong advocate for the company too.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The smart new £15 million accident and emergency unit at Huddersfield Royal Infirmary opened in the early hours of this morning. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the team at HRI, welcoming the new doctors and nurses who have been recruited for the A&E unit? And does he agree with me that alongside the new teaching block at Greenhead College, the West Yorkshire Investment Zone and the Trans-Pennine Rail upgrade, it shows that we are delivering for my constituents in the Holme and Colne Valleys and Lindley?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my honourable friend and his constituents for the brand new A&E department at the Huddersfield Royal Hospital. It is, as he said, a real game changer for residents, and it's not the only piece of delivery in his area. He mentioned the Trans-Pennine Rail upgrade, delivering faster journeys, but also levelling up projects like Huddersfield's Open Market and the new teaching block at Greenhead College. It shows that it's the Conservatives that are delivering on the priorities of his local community.
The International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor seeking arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. This House does not aid and abet Hamas, but it does aid and abet Israel through arms sales like components for Israeli F-35s, known as the most lethal fighter jet on earth, which are raining down hell on Gaza. So, will the Prime Minister uphold international law, drop the nonsense about the most robust licensing system in the world, and end arms sales to Israel? And if the ICC issues arrest warrants, will he comply and ensure that these individuals are arrested if they enter the UK?
Mr. Speaker, always nice to see the Change Labour Party in action. When it comes to the ICC, this is a deeply unhelpful development, Mr. Speaker, which is, of course, still subject to a final decision. There is no moral equivalence between a democratically elected government exercising its lawful right to self-defence and the actions of a terrorist group. And the actions of the ICC do absolutely nothing to get a pause in the fighting, to get the hostages out, or aid in.
Craig Mackinlay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an emotional day for me, and if you would indulge me to say a few thanks, because there are a few are due. And one of those, of course, well, an apology, actually, that I've caused the breaking of so many rules today. Clapping. I've got trainers on because my shoes wouldn't go over the plastic feet, and my jacket wouldn't go over the bionic arm. So apologies for that. But I want to give some thanks. And first of all, the thanks to you, Mr. Speaker, for being there for me, for coming to visit. And I will tell everybody the little story. They thought, the rest of the hospital thought I must be dreadfully ill, because they said, that guy's got the funeral director in already. But no, you've cared for me throughout, and I thank you for that. The other person in this chamber I'd like to thank is the Prime Minister, who's been with me throughout. He hasn't advertised it. He's been to see me multiple times. And to me, that shows the true depth of the character of the Prime Minister, and thank you for that. And to my wife, who's in the chamber, and my daughter and other family members, my father-in-law, I'd like to thank my wife for being there every single day of those many months in hospital. And she could only do that because of the support of family behind her. And in the public gallery, they can't quite see me, unfortunately, are many of the staff from the NHS who took me from where I was, close to death, they took me from close to death to where I am today, so thank you for that. I'm not entirely sure I'm that happy that the two surgeons who took this lot off are there, but never mind. But can I ask the Prime Minister, there is a question here. Prime Minister, can we please ensure that we embed recognition of early signs of sepsis? It wouldn't have worked for me. Mine was too quick and too sudden. But for many people, they do get a few days. If we can stop somebody ending up like this, I would say that's a job well done. But also, Mr. Speaker, to impress upon your health ministers to allow the provision of appropriate prosthetics, particularly for multi-limb amputees, at the right time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's so wonderful to hear from my honourable friend. Can I thank him for his kind words, but also personally pay tribute to his family who are here. And I know firsthand the extraordinary job they did to support him over the past several months, and they all deserve our absolute admiration and thanks for what they've done. And on the substantive question that he raises, before I do that, can I also join him in paying tribute to the NHS workers who looked after him? He's right that sepsis is a devastating condition, and we're working hard to raise awareness of it, and I know that he will play a leading role in doing that. And without getting into all the details, I'll just say that he is right. The NHS itself has recognised this morning that more needs to be done, and I can assure him that we will do that. The Right Honourable Friend will discuss with him shortly, as will I, his suggestions on how we can improve care and awareness for people. But I'll end where I started earlier today, Mr. Speaker, and just say, Craig, you've inspired each and every one of us. Thank you.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, that was an unusual and emotional start and finish to Prime Minister's questions, because you will have seen there the Conservative MP for South Thanet thanking all sorts of people for saving his life and making a personal tribute to the Prime Minister for coming to visit him in hospital, arriving and, as he said, breaking protocols, clapping. He was clapped in at the very beginning. He'd been to see the Speaker of the House of Commons. He told a very funny, I suppose, story of when Sir Lindsay Hoyle went to visit him in hospital. But he's back in the chamber today for his first PMQs and got the final question, which seemed fitting. And that question was around embedding action for early signs of sepsis, because it was that life-threatening condition that meant that Craig Mackinlay lost both his hands and his feet, and is and has been in the Commons today because he has had prosthetic limbs fitted. Now, the main exchanges between Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, and the Prime Minister were on the contaminated blood scandal. And we shall go into some detail on that in just a moment. But let's welcome our guests for this part of Politics Live. Gareth Davis, Treasury Minister for the Government, Ian Murray, the Shadow Scotland Secretary, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young. It was also an unusual PMQs for a couple of other reasons. Before we get to the general election speculation, it has been noted that expletives were used by an SNP MP. Apologies for that, but as we are covering Prime Minister's questions live, we weren't expecting it, and it's very difficult to pull away when you don't know that it's going to happen. Alison Thewlis was quoting from an email. Speculation about the general election. We talked about it before we went to Prime Minister's questions, but Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, was the one who asked the question head on. Well, Prime Minister, are you going to call a summer election, or are you feared? That Scottish word for frightened to do so. Are you bottling it? I seem to remember that was asked of Gordon Brown when he became Prime Minister. What do we know, and why has this become such an issue today?
Look, I think the first thing to say is to be completely honest and say there's probably about 8 people that know, and unfortunately none of them are sitting around this table.
Vicki?
I don't think. So look, we don't know. We've been here before. Because we no longer have set-term parliaments, it is in the gift of the Prime Minister. He has said it will be in the second half of the year. That's his working assumption. That, of course, would start on the 1st of July.
Indeed.
So I think what's happened is over the last few months, there's been moments where there are final times to call an election for certain dates. So the May local elections was one. There was a load of speculation just before that. And then this next one would be the 4th of July would be the next one. Now, that's just before the holiday season starts, particularly schools breaking up in Scotland, for example, and other parts of the United Kingdom. So I think we do get these flurries around those occasions. All I can say is that this feels different, mainly because Downing Street haven't quashed the speculation. So in the past, these rumours have started. You speak to certain people and they will say, look, it's not happening. You all need to calm down, go and have lunch. That is not being what's happening. Also, separately, there's a cabinet at 4:15 this afternoon. Cabinet meetings are normally on a Tuesday morning. They didn't happen for a very good reason. Yesterday, the Prime Minister was abroad. But I think that is also fueling some speculation. There's also speculation it might be a reshuffle, potentially. It would be around the last time you could do a reshuffle if there's going to be an autumn election.
And that's because the Northern Ireland Secretary, Christine Harris, has said he's not standing again. Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary, isn't standing again, and so on.
So they might do that as well. But, you know, the truth is, why would they want to do it in July? You know, there's good news today for the economy in terms of inflation coming down. But I think it's very interesting. Look below that. The markets are now saying that they don't think an interest rate cut is as likely as it was for this summer. And there was a lot of people in government saying, look, we hold on, we have a couple of interest rate cuts, people will then start to feel better. If that doesn't happen, instead, you've got potentially, I think, hundreds of thousands of people coming off fixed-term mortgages and will feel a whole lot worse. So you can see the reason why they might be thinking about it. But as I say, I'm not going to pretend that I know. There are very few people who do know.
Is there going to be a summer election in July?
I think the Prime Minister's been pretty consistent, including at Prime Minister's questions. He's always said it's going to be the second half.
But technically, that could be July.
Year. I guess technically it could, but he's remained consistent in saying it's going to be the second half of this year, and it is entirely his decision to make, and I'm afraid I don't know otherwise.
Right. No rumblings within the Treasury. Jeremy Hunt talking about preparations. Now we've had the news that inflation, the rate of inflation at least, has come down to the target, close to it, not to it exactly, but close to the target of 2% for the Bank of England.
Well, that's exactly what we've been talking about today, not the wider speculation that you started the programme with. I think it's important that your viewers understand how far we've come on inflation, from 11.1% down to 2.3%. This is a really meaningful change.
So why not call? So it would be a good time to have a general election.
Well, that's something that the Prime Minister will decide. But what I know is that this is definitely something that will impact families across the country. It's something that shows that the economy has turned a corner. Well, if you just look at growth is up, real wages are up, inflation is down now significantly. We're in a good place on the economy, and it's going to get better.
Really, you think you're in a good place on the economy? I mean, just to put it into some sort of context, the fall in inflation, of course, doesn't mean that all prices are coming down. It means that prices are rising slower than they were. Do you accept prices have gone up massively over the last couple of years and in many cases are still going up?
Completely. And every time I've been on this show and any interview I've done, I've always said we can't be complacent. We have to be vigilant to inflation because it is about prices going up. Now, they are significantly, inflation is significantly reduced. We're nearly at
And you're taking credit for that, rightly or wrongly, that the rate of inflation is coming down. Do you also take the blame for the fact that it reached record highs of 11% 3 years ago and has been at that level for quite some time? Yes, coming down slowly.
So, again, I've never taken full credit for inflation going down, but the IMF has said that the government took decisive action. I think this is really important, so let me try and explain really clearly. What caused inflation was two factors in particular that impacted countries around the world. It was the war in Ukraine, which shot up gas prices and wholesale... well, it's really important because you did challenge me on it.
I did, but we heard it. We heard it. We heard that in the comments.
The second thing was supply chain shortages out of China, and that's why across the world inflation shot up. Now, how you tackle inflation is the question. And the principal lever is through interest rates. And we are not in charge of interest rates. That's the independent Bank of England and the Monetary Policy Committee.
All right.
So they have the principal lever and they've to take an independent action.
So in a way, none of this is to do with you.
No, well, I'm just trying to get to that point to address your question directly. So what we can do in the Treasury is two things. One, make sure that we do not exacerbate inflation. And that means making difficult decisions on public sector pay. It means not introducing tax cuts too early, which would push up inflation. And secondly, it means that we have to make sure that we introduce policy levers like the energy price guarantee, which the OBR were clear would reduce inflation by 2%.
Are you convinced by that analysis of what the government has done to help bring down the rate of inflation and make the economy on a surer footing?
Well, viewers will be watching this and be worried about how they pay their bills at the end of this week and the end of this month. And we always hear from the government trying to claim credit for this kind of stuff. They did crash the economy 2 years ago, which has pushed up interest rates more. We were left more exposed in terms of the energy crisis because of decisions that have been made over the last 14 years. And as we sit here today speculating about an election, a general election, we are 14 years into this government, and the best that the Treasury Minister can tell us is that things are getting slightly better and none of it is their responsibility. So really, you can't have it both ways. If everything is rosy in the garden, call the election and let's get the public to decide. If everything isn't rosy in the garden, then take some responsibility for it. And they're refusing to take responsibility for that.
Right, Gareth?
I've consistently, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor has always said that we have, had to deal with some of the most remarkable events with the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And we've always been clear, whether it's the support that we had to provide, which has pushed up debt, or the other measures that we've had to take. This has been a really traumatic time for our economy and economies around the world.
Yes, but the trebling of national debt has nothing to do with the support that you gave to COVID and to energy support, because you've trebled the national debt to £2.5 trillion. That is not the cost of what you've put in place for helping people through COVID and the energy crisis. So actually, it's been economic incompetence for the last 14 years that's left the economy fragile, left growth on its knees and flatlining for the last 14 years, which meant when these crises hit, we weren't prepared and we weren't in a position to be able to come through it as well as we could have done. That is the scenario here. And actually, I wouldn't call him the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'd call him the Chancellor of the Exchequer, because you see what he's been saying this week in the speech that he did on Monday about blaming the Labour Party, and actually you need to take either responsibility for it or take responsibility for fixing it. You can't have no responsibility for the problem and take
so debt has gone up clearly by £500 billion because we provided £400 billion through COVID, which the Labour Party has supported every step of the way. In fact, asked for more borrowing throughout the pandemic, and then we stepped in when energy prices spiked by effectively paying 50% of people's energy bills through the energy price guarantee, which I think you again supported. And so we're very clear about
the reason the energy bills went up so high was because Britain was exposed more than any other country in the world, in fact, to the energy spikes because of the Ukraine war, because we were over-reliant on foreign dictators and we were over-reliant on foreign gas.
I'm afraid
because there is no onshore wind. You banned onshore wind. There is no gas or energy storage in this country, so you left us overly exposed. So those chickens came home to roost when those crises came along.
Can I just ask the question, which is the sort of age-old question, is will voters feel better off at the election, whenever it is called, sometime this year, when you just look at these food prices and their rises since 2020? You can see the price of a whole chicken from March 2020 to March 2024. Look at the red lines going up on cheddar cheese, on sliced white bread, on semi-skimmed milk. Gareth, can you say people will feel better off at the next election?
I make absolutely clear that when you have food inflation at 19%, which is what we had, people will obviously feel the impact of that. Headline inflation of 11.1%, obviously people will feel that. And as a result of that inflation, rates have had to rise, which impacts everybody, businesses, individuals, families, of course. But we have turned a corner. Things are on a downward trajectory now, and we've cut taxes for the average earners, and they will start to feel that. They will start to see that in their pay packet.
I really don't accept that, because taxes at their highest level in 70 years, living standards have dropped to its lowest level since the 1950s, since records began. And we're now in a position whereby people are sitting at home looking at this government, at Prime Minister's questions, or indeed spokespeople when they come on television, saying that everything's fine. You've never had it so good.
That's not
I don't think that's quite what they're saying. But anyway, all right.
Well, any solutions to any of these problems. He's not said what tax he's going to cut. If you're worried about the tax burden, what are you going to cut?
The tax burden is a 70-year high.
What are you going to cut?
We're going to step back just for a moment and return to the issue of the contaminated blood scandal, because it was certainly a historic moment, really, in Parliament earlier, and the press conferences held by those families, and so perhaps it was unsurprising that there was a sombre mood from Sir Keir Starmer asking the government and saying there was some consensus, obviously on the apologies, and on the issue of compensation, and that it should be paid in full by the end of the year. That's the commitment the government made. But Keir Starmer went on to something called a duty of candour, in the spirit of wanting to ensure that this could never happen again, attacking the sort of culture that means people feel they cannot come forward and say when things are going drastically and tragically wrong in some of our institutions, in this case the NHS.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people will be thinking, well, why do you need a change in law or something to make sure that happens? Why don't people speak out about it? And I think lots of people watching, not this, just the blood scandal, but it's this pattern of behaviour, and that is what Sir Keir Starmer talked about as well, and which we can all see. The fact that this is a tragedy and a scandal that's been going on for decades, but the fact that it's now reached the point of trying to deal with it at the same time as the post office scandal, it's followed Hillsborough. There just seem to be so many different examples of it. And I do think as well it's about trust. It's about people's trust in these institutions and how that has inevitably been worn away. People are going to be looking at institutions and not trusting what the people who they should trust, the experts or the people who are delivering services to them, that they don't trust them anymore. And that is a dangerous place, I think, for governments, for institutions to be in.
Right, duty of candour. What is it that you are calling for? A binding duty of candour on all public servants, I think I heard Sir Keir Starmer put to Rishi Sunak, to tell a person or a family or an advocate that when something has gone wrong, they apologise, they offer an appropriate remedy or support to put matters right. You want that written into law?
Yes, because it's a cultural issue across Whitehall, across our public services now. We've had Hillsborough, as you've already mentioned. We've had Windrush. We've had Grenfell. The post office scandal, the former boss, Paula Venables, is at the inquiry today.
We're going to hear a little bit of that in a moment.
We've now seen over the last few weeks. And if you just look at and examine these over the course of years, if not even in some instances decades, there has been cover-up, there's been people who've been trying to whistle-blow. So that duty of candour would give people the confidence in those institutions, both from an employee's perspective, but also from a public's perspective when using public services.
Would you want the government to sign up to that?
So I'm aware of this recommendation in the report, and as the Prime Minister said at Prime Minister's Question Time, we will look very, very carefully and are sympathetic to that recommendation, but we do want time to be able to digest the report and the recommendations, and we certainly don't rule out any further legislation down the line, but I can't say any more at this point, but we will look at it very carefully.
I just want to refer to something that Sir Brian Langstaff put in his published report on Monday. We heard the apologies and we heard the Cabinet Office Minister John Glenn yesterday outlining the details of the compensation scheme for those affected, and obviously you're in the Treasury. But the inquiry report outlined a whole host of failures by successive governments over many decades and also criticised the current government, saying the lack of transparency over delays to compensation was a serious failing that replicates the wrongs of the past. Why did the government drag its heels over compensation when you had the interim report setting out the compensation that hasn't changed from Sir Brian Langstaff over a year ago?
Well, I think there were interim payments made, but we've always said that we wanted to wait for the full report.
But why? Why? Because two people affected by this scandal are dying every week. They could have had that compensation. That's what Sir Brian Langstaff said.
So I understand that, but if you have a inquiry and you have you await a full report, I think it's important that you do wait for that report and the full recommendations, and then you take action once it is published. It has now been published, and we are taking action.
Did Labour do enough, though, to hold the government's feet to fire here?
I was going to say I think we should take the politics out of this because this is such an important issue, but if we just reflect back on what happened over the last year, it was backbench amendments from Diana Johnson that pushed this onto the
Labour
agenda
MP.
and got it into law for compensation to be paid, and I think we've lost a year, and that maybe the duty of candour conversation and the delay in payments and setting up the compensation scheme should be seen in the same thing as really organisations and particularly governments need to get on to do these things to give people the confidence that actually their institutions work for them.
Well, we've all mentioned the Post Office and the scandal there over the failings of the Horizon IT system. Well, Paula Venables, the former CEO of the Post Office, has been giving evidence and became quite emotional at one point when being questioned about what unfolded in her time as CEO of the Post Office. Let's have a listen.
Why were you telling these parliamentarians that every prosecution involving the Horizon system had been successful and had found in favour of the Post Office?
I fully accept now that the post office, excuse me, the post office knew that. I completely accepted. Personally, I didn't know that, and I'm incredibly sorry that that happened to those people and to so many others.
Well, that was Paula Venables, clearly feeling overwhelmed. And no surprise, really, for what happened when she was in charge of the post office. But the question, it begs the question, what is there, what guarantee is there that there isn't another scandal already happening as we watch because of the issues that have been raised? Gareth?
Events, I'm afraid, happen. What it's important is when they do, government get to the bottom of the issue and take action. And with the case of the Horizon scandal, obviously incredibly traumatic and incorrect and just wrong in many ways. And that's why we've got an inquiry going on at the moment.
Now, you know the length of time is the problem and the struggle. Let's say in a new era of transparency, would you, as a government minister, encourage a doctor, a public servant, a CEO to come forward and go public if they have any suspicion that something is going terribly wrong?
Of course, I would always encourage anybody in any
But clearly the culture isn't there for people to do that. That's why they haven't up until now.
And we have to learn lessons and move forward. But of course, I would encourage anybody who sees any wrongdoing in any organisation to report that. Of course I would.
And it seems to me that the first attitude is let's circle the wagons and protect people rather than try and whistle-blow on what's happening. Some people will get it wrong, but actually let's investigate things so these tragedies can't happen again.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests on a very busy and dramatic day again in Parliament, with speculation about a general election being called by the Prime Minister for July. We'll bring you that, of course, when we know. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Come on, Ben, you're going to be late. Ben.